Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, Play the Opinion Potomac Watch Podcast. That is, Play the Opinion Potomac Watch Podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal with Kim Strassel and Bill McGurn. And we just want to finish today, if our listeners don't mind, a point of editorial privilege here, talking about our colleague Evan Gershkovich. He's the 32-year-old reporter for the Wall Street Journal, had been reporting in Russia, Russian-speaking, reporting what he heard and saw in that country, and was arrested a year from Friday. And he's been languishing in Lefortovo prison in Moscow ever since. No formal charges, though there's the allegation that he somehow was committing espionage. The Journal and the U.S. government have both vehemently denied that. There's been no formal charges yet. It's still in what Moscow court called investigative phase, but his detention was extended for another 3 months on Tuesday at the request of the Russian security service, the FSB. Evan is the first American journalist taken since the end of the Cold War. He's held up very well by all accounts of people who've seen him, but it is a horrible predicament he is in, and he really is, Kim, at the mercy of one Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, it's absolutely dreadful. And I would stress what you just said about being the first journalist in that long, because it says something about the tactics that Putin is using and his escalation. Obviously, other Americans have been detained. We had Brittany Griner, we've had Paul Whelan is over there, so business people, etc. But taking a journalist is a new step. It's one that really should stand in its own category because of the knock-on effects when stuff like that happens. What ends up happening is other reporters then understand the risk. There are fewer people on the ground. There are fewer people to write about the atrocities, and there's a fear that goes around. That's the goal of Putin. It's not just that he now has this leverage and this hostage, as it were, but it's a way of further denying, as it were, any coverage of what's happening in that country. It's why it was such a dramatic and awful step and something that needs to be universally condemned, in addition and alongside the work to get Evan out and get him his freedom.
The Biden administration has been working to get him released, so far to no avail. And let's listen to Joe Biden.
Here in this chamber tonight are families whose loved ones are still being held by Hamas. I pledge to all the families that we will not rest until we bring every one of your loved ones home. We will also work around the clock to bring home Evan and Paul, Americans being unjustly detained by the Russians.
That's Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan, a former Marine who has been in custody in Russia for 5 years now. Typically, Bill, these things now are settled with prisoner swaps. It's unfortunate that that's the case, but that's kind of where we are now geopolitically here. Russians and others, the Iranians, practice this kidnapping, hostage-taking as well in order to spring some of the people that are held for actually having committed crimes in the United States. But it doesn't look right now that Putin wants anyone that is in American custody now. The guy he really wants is an assassin by the name of Vadim Krasikov, who killed a Chechen insurgent leader in cold blood in a park in Germany with children watching in 2019. Now in prison in Germany, but understandably, Germany, given the nature of Krasikov's crime, doesn't want to let him out easily.
Yeah, I'm not going to criticize anyone involved in what the negotiations are, because it's a really tough place. We have an innocent man, two innocent men, as I understand, wrongfully detained by Putin just for cold-blooded reasons. He figures they'll be useful for him at some point. He's in no rush. There's no incentive for him to release these guys. So I think it's just important the president keeps their names out there. Paul, you lived abroad for many years. You know when you're abroad, you're very vulnerable. And if you're taken wrongfully, the only thing you have going for you is that your home country doesn't forget you and presses your case. So I was heartened that they were mentioned, the Hamas hostages, Paul Whelan and Evan. at the State of the Union, and I'll wait to see what comes by. But there's just little incentive for Putin, and there's another incentive. Say he makes a deal, frees these guys, and then takes more people when he needs them, when he wants something. And no one's quite figured out a good way around that.
Well, that's exactly right, Bill. That's the incentive that you cede and negotiate for swaps. Now, we want desperately to get Evan back, so I'm not going to oppose any swap here. Certainly, any decision that the U.S. government makes in that regard, that's our main goal, getting him out. But I do think that Evan's arrest and predicament does show how much the world has changed from when I was traveling in the 1980s in some hotspot around the world, Afghanistan, Pakistan, along the Afghan border, and the Philippines and other places where there were revolutions and democratic protests and revolutions. But American power stood for a lot more there at that time. There was a lot more reluctance on the part of these governments to take Americans prisoners, especially journalists, Kim.
Yeah, I think that's sort of what I was trying to say is in terms of this and the escalation, which is undoubtedly brought on because folks like Putin or Xi or others don't necessarily fear anymore an American retribution or the repercussions of engaging in that, not just by taking journalists, but others. And, when I sit and I think about the list of countries today that I would not go to unless directly ordered, and even then potentially not, just because of the risk of knowing that these guys actually now view the possibility of a journalist, especially anyone that has ever been critical of their regime, stepping on their grounds and drumming up and ginning up an excuse for arresting you. And you're entirely at their mercy. And then, as you said, we're also playing a kind of gentleman's game here, but one-sided in that we aren't necessarily grabbing their people to use for trades. I suppose there's a risk there of escalation. That would probably be the argument that you got from some diplomats. But it does mean that we aren't playing with the same deck of cards, as it were. And if we're not willing to take any other actions either, it really does leave us with very few options.
True, Kim. Look, we at the Journal are going to keep Evan's name in the news and in the public mind as often as we can. We are doing our best to try to make sure that he is taken care of to the extent you can in prison, that he's treated well. And we are doing everything we can, pulling whatever levers we can to try to get him out. And we will continue to do that. He is in our thoughts. And we hope he will be in the thoughts of our listeners as well. Thank you all for joining us on Potomac Watch. We're here every day, and thanks for listening.